Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and very good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. I know it is not election season yet, but I'm sure all of us in the room understand that institutional reforms, especially when you're talking about electoral reforms, are not something that you can do within 6 months before the next general elections. Which is why I think we started this process very, very early, where we've just recently celebrated 1 year of having a new government for Malaysia. And I'm sure all of you are aware that the kind of changes that we want or we desire for need a lot of hard work behind it, and hard work needs to start with information, and which is why we are here today. So we have two esteemed gentlemen who will be giving their presentations on electoral systems. But a few housekeeping rules before we begin. Can I ask everybody to please put your phones on silent and to not disrupt the whole forum. We will have presentations from both our speakers. I will call them up to rostrum and presentations are going to be up. And then we will follow this with a Q&A. There will be roving mics available. Just please raise your hand. I will allow the mics to come to you. Please introduce yourself and please keep your questions very precise. Okay? So without further ado, may I invite Professor Benjamin Reilly to give his presentation. Prof Reilly is currently professor in the School of Social Sciences, the University of Western Australia, working on research and engagement in a range of policy and international issues across the Indo-Pacific, with publications on electoral systems in the region. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Liana, and thank you to Sunway University and Chin Huat and everyone who's come along today for this discussion. I wanted to just put the issue of Malaysia's electoral arrangements and possible changes into a bit of a comparative context. And I think Chin Huat will talk about some more of the specifics. But we have had the opportunity over the last few days to have some discussions with your Electoral Commission, Electoral Reform Committee, civil society and others. So that's helped clarify that there are indeed a couple of potential reform options floating around that might be informed by comparative experience. I want to, first of all, I think as such a knowledgeable audience, you're probably well aware of many of the broader context, but for those who aren't, what's happened in Malaysia over the last year is even more significant on a global scale because most of the world is going in the other direction. So this is a graph from Freedom House that charts these things, and essentially many more countries have moved in a less democratic, more authoritarian direction in recent years than have improved their democracy. And so what's happened in Malaysia is sort of a bright spot in the world, and it's one reason that I think the Malaysian transition has got so much attention internationally. So everyone's watching Malaysia at present, okay? You're all being watched by the rest of the world. And what happens here in Malaysia, I think, will be influential, not just, of course, for this country, but I think it will have some implications internationally for other countries as well. This is a map of democracy in the world today. Countries in green are essentially democratic. Countries in purple are autocratic, non-democracies. And then there's a whole bunch of countries in yellow, including, I think, Malaysia on this map. So, yeah, and here in this part of the world, when it comes to established democracies in Asia, we're really talking still about Japan, Korea, Taiwan. There's a lot of countries that clearly are non-democratic, a lot of countries that are near China, for example. And then there's this in-between zone. And that's really where Malaysia is at present, somewhere in between. But if we look at electoral democracies, Malaysia's not included. It's not included at present. And I think you all know why it's not included. Nearly all countries that would be on that map, and they're classed as democratic or semi-democratic, have had not just lots of elections, but lots of transitions of government. And the fact that Malaysia has only really had a transition of government once now in the last year, unless we go back a long time in history, has meant that it's still seen as a case that could go either way. Could go in a more democratic direction, could go in a more autocratic direction. There's a theory of democracy based on how many turnovers of government a country can peacefully have. And often scholars will talk about having at least 2 turnovers in a row. So, you know, the Indonesians have managed to do that. Philippines have had lots since Marcos. Singaporeans haven't had any. So that's one of the reasons why Singapore doesn't appear on any of these measures of democracy either, even though in many ways it's a very successful country and very successful society. Which brings me to the issue of electoral systems, because electoral systems are one of the key ways that democracy can be embedded in a country, or indeed that you can mess things up. Right? There's no such thing as a magic bullet, but electoral systems shape the incentives of politicians to behave in particular ways. So if we can design our electoral system to promote the sorts of outcomes that we might want, for example, cross-ethnic tolerance, moderation, centrist politics, for example, we're more likely to build the prospects for an enduring democracy. And equally, if we mess up the design of electoral systems, you can really undermine the prospects of a democratic transition. So all the work that's taking place now, that some of the people here in this room are working on at the Electoral Reform Committee and elsewhere, is really important, not just in terms of the electoral process, but the much broader issue of democracy. Where systems are not well designed, we're going to run into problems. So, what is an electoral system? It's primarily the way votes are converted into seats, which sounds very dry. In this country, it's a first-past-the-post system. Whoever gets the most votes in a constituency wins, even if they don't get a majority of the vote. But there are lots and lots of other electoral systems used around the world. And in fact, the system that's used here in Malaysia, first-past-the-post, was once quite common, but is not so common anymore. And particularly in East Asia, most countries that use this system have, in the past, have moved away from first-past-the-post. Some have moved towards requiring an absolute majority rather than just a plurality to win, which is the case in Malaysia today, more votes than anyone else. Some countries say we want the winner of any constituency to achieve over 50%. And I'll talk in a minute about ways that can be done. Other countries have moved towards proportional representation, where you don't have any local members at all. You have a larger group of politicians elected on, say, a statewide or nationwide basis. And the point of proportional systems is very simple. It's to guarantee that any party that gets, say, 10% of the vote will get 10% of the seats. A party that gets 20% of the vote will get 20% of the seats. So it's to guarantee an exact equivalence between the proportion of the vote that a party gets, its support in the community, and an exact representation of that in Parliament. And then there are mixtures of the two, where some part of the Parliament is elected proportionately and some part are elected from local districts. And in fact, this has been the most popular model worldwide and also in Asia in recent years. You guys know all about that. I'll come back to that. So this is a schematic representation from a book that I did with some colleagues a few years ago of all the different kinds of electoral systems that are used in different countries around the world. And this is the one that's currently used in Malaysia. But as you'll see, there are many, many other options under different kinds of systems that could be experimented with and that may be more appropriate for a country like Malaysia. And one of the things that's going on today is people thinking about whether this opportunity for reform that has opened up recently by virtue of the transition of government, whether there may be some more appropriate electoral systems for Malaysia that might work better or might produce different kinds of politics than the politics you have today. So it's a debate that's currently raging. Let me just, before I move on to some specifics, point out this is a map of the electoral systems used around the world. So huge variation, like I said. If we even look just at Asia, the countries that use the same electoral system as Malaysia in this dark browny reddy colour, it's really only India, Myanmar, pretty much everyone else, some of the smaller Pacific islands. But most countries use a different system. Most countries have moved to something else. The most popular system, the green colour on the map, in Southeast Asia and in East Asia is mixed systems where there is part of the parliament elected usually at a national level by proportional representation, some districts, some seats elected from local districts, just as you do now, but maybe only half or two-thirds of the parliament that elected that way, the other half or maybe one-third elected at a national level. And this system, this mixture of systems has proved quite popular. The other popular system used around the world is just a straight proportional representation model, like they use in Indonesia. And as I said, this model is very good for ensuring a fairly direct equivalence between the proportion of the vote that a party wins and the number of seats that it wins in parliament. And it's also can be good for ensuring the representation of minorities, can be very useful for ensuring better representation of women, because you can put in place rules that say every second or third place on a party list has to be a woman, for example. So you can use it to engineer particular outcomes that you may want to achieve. Now this is the whole subject of electoral engineering is really, I guess, what we're talking about here today. And it's not just Malaysia where this could be relevant. In fact, many countries in Asia over the years have tried to use their electoral system to change the way politics works, change the way the broader political system works. So we're not just talking about which party wins. We're talking about something deeper than that. How does the political system operate in general? So there's a few examples there. Let me quickly run through them. So the Japanese, back in the 80s and early 90s, had come to the conclusion that if they were continue to be economically successful, they needed to move away from their old electoral system, which was allowed the LDP to just dominate everything, created lots of internal incentives for corruption, and they really felt that they wanted a system more like the classic American or UK two-party system. So they changed their electoral system to achieve this, and they have got something much more like a two-party system now. They've had alternation of government. Okay, so they use the electoral system to reform their party system. The Thais wanted the opposite. I think for not very good reasons, but over the last decade, the military junta and the various people in charge in Thailand have used the electoral system essentially to make sure that they don't ever have a Thaksin party, a one big party that wins power, which happened back in the 2000s, and tries to reshape Thai politics. They didn't want that, okay? So they've used the electoral system, again, quite successfully, to refragment their politics so much that no one party can ever govern outright in its own right again. And, you know, maybe not threaten the king and the royal family and the Bangkok elite like maybe Thaksin was seen as doing. So, again, I'm not saying it's a good idea, but it's been very successful in changing the way politics works. Nepal, as part of their peace process, wanted to guarantee that all of the country's diversity in terms of ethnic groups would be represented in parliament. So they've passed electoral laws that force every political party to put ethnic minorities on the candidate lists in proportion to the population as a whole. Very ambitious sort of social engineering, political engineering. Very difficult to do because they're not just putting minorities in that case, they're also putting privileged groups. on the party list. But they've used the electoral system to do that. Indonesia was the opposite. Indonesia was very worried. The Indonesian politicians, when Suharto fell and they had to rebuild a democratic system, their main worry was that the country would break up if every province and island group were allowed to have their own local parties. That a lot of those parties, you know, you'd get a Papua party and the next thing you knew, they'd be saying, we're voting for independence, we're going to separate. So they use the electoral system to make sure that there can't be any local parties, which means there's no ethnic parties in Indonesia. Every party has to be national. And they actually require all parties to have offices in every province and in every local government district within every province, right, before they can compete in elections. So they engineer a national political party system to avoid the problem of ethnic separatism, and they use the electoral system to do it. The Singaporeans just wanted to keep the PAP in power, so that's and they've been successful. Lots of electoral engineering there. So a lot of countries have tried to use the electoral system, as I said, to improve the gender balance as well. So there's lots of things that can be done in terms of designing an electoral system. Now, one of the issues that has come up repeatedly when it comes to Malaysia, political scientists know about Malaysia mostly from other countries, I mean, people like me, because we've read about this very distinctive way in which Malaysian politics developed balancing the representation of the main ethnic groups, the main communal groups in Malaysia, in a way that brought them into a kind of a coalition government, right? That's how it used to work in the day, and still does to some extent. And Malaysia was famously seen as an example of what's called vote pooling, where the Barisan coalition would sometimes run a Chinese candidate in a district that had a lot of Malay voters, or a Malay candidate in a district which needed some Chinese voters, and where you got a level of cross-ethnic voting going on. And the argument in the political science literature in the 80s and before was that this was one very effective way of maintaining, you know, a degree of ethnic harmony and without the political system falling apart. Okay, since then, of course, Malaysian democracy was seen as having declined. Now, I don't want to go into the details because you all know far more than me about Malaysia, but there was a sense in which maybe that level of intercommunal interdependence wasn't working quite as well in the electoral system. So one of the issues that's come up in our discussions today is whether there's a way of using the electoral system to try and promote more centrist politics in countries like Malaysia that have deep ethnic divisions. I put this up just because this isn't how politics works in most ethnically divided countries. This is how we like to imagine politics works in, say, Australia, my country. But just as an example, we assume that you can array all voters between the far left, communists, right? There's probably a few communists in Australia. I've never met one, but they're probably there. And the far right, libertarians. Okay? But that's not where most voters are. Most voters are somewhere in the middle, in the centre. Yeah, they're in the centre. And to win elections, you have to appeal to the political centre. And not just appeal to the political centre, the political parties are trying to locate this mythical person called the median voter. The median voter is at the dead centre of the entire political spectrum. And what the political parties do is try and craft their messages and their policies, their rhetoric, to appeal to that imaginary median voter, okay? And you end up with a rather boring political system because the focus is always on the political centre for the parties who want to win government. Now, boring but sustainable. In our case, for a long time, and in cases like the UK and so on, for much longer. That's the model, at least. What happens when you're in a society that's divided along identity lines? The incentives for politics are different. You're not trying to find the median voter because it's not clear there is a median voter. What you're trying to do is appeal often to your own community. But there's a problem. If you craft political appeals designed to appeal to one specific ethnic group, instead of pushing towards the political centre, the nature of the politics is often then will push more towards the extremes, particularly if, say, there are two parties competing for the vote of a particular community. The incentive is always to get a bit more extreme and say the other party's a sellout and not looking after our interests and so on. So instead of having this centrist, centripetal kind of democracy, which is how more or less politics does work in societies that aren't ethnically divided, in democracies that aren't ethnically divided, you tend to get this model. Apparently my time's up, so my time's up, or who's the boss? You're the boss, okay. All right. All right, I will hurry along. So let me just tell you about one potential reform that some countries have been using to try to manage this problem. Or it's basically just a different augmentation of Firstpastthepost. We use it in Australia. They're using it for some seats of Congress in America. The mayor of London's elected this way. You basically give voters more choice on the ballot, and you ask them not to just say who their favoured candidate is, but if they want to, who would be their second choice if their favoured candidate doesn't win? And if they can't have that person, who would be their third choice? This is how we do it in Australia. This is from a recent election to the US Congress from the state of Maine. And they say, okay, just fill in a box. There's your first choice, there's your second choice, there's your third choice. So the logic of this system for a politician is that you really can't afford to be too negative because you won't pick up any second choice votes, right? You want to be at least nice enough. You don't have to be nice, but you have to be acceptable to voters who are voting for someone else so that you get like maybe a number 2 vote or a number 3 vote. Or maybe in an ethnically divided society, it might be that once voters chosen people from their own community, they decide to vote from someone from the other community who they think is okay, at least not an extremist. Okay, that's the logic. What that means is a very simple way of doing it. That's probably the best way of doing it. Just give people a first choice and a second choice, something like that. But what that means, I won't do that, is that when you come to count the votes, which is a little bit more complicated than counting Firstpastthepost, you actually use, if no one gets an absolute majority, you use these second choice votes to work out who the median choice of the electorate is. All right? Who would be the overall acceptable choice? Now, that's a kind of centripetal electoral system that's, a modest reform to Firstpastthepost. There are lots of others. I mentioned the Indonesian system. This sort of system probably would need ethnically mixed electorates to work in a case like Malaysia. But it's certainly one potential option for addressing this problem of extremism. And the Americans adopted this system not because they're worried about ethnic polarisation, they're just worried about polarisation of their politics in general. So I think this is there's some more information, but I will have to finish up. So, here's the problem. This is my last slide. The problem is that anyone can analyse the problems of an electoral system, but whoever's in government now will tend to like the system. And that's the same everywhere. It may even be the case in Malaysia. I don't know. You guys can tell me. But so it's very hard to change electoral systems. They normally don't get changed. Every now and then there is a window of opportunity that opens up, and maybe this is a window now where politicians are looking not just at what system got us here, but what would be the best system for the future of the country. And maybe this is now the opportunity for Malaysia to start thinking about some of these ideas. I will finish on that point, and thank you very much, and hopefully we can have some questions later.
Thank you, Ben. I'm just going to briefly introduce Dr. Wong Chin Huat. He's currently a Senior Fellow for Jeffrey Sachs Centre on Sustainable Development, Sunway University. He is also a member of our Electoral Reform Committee and was actually instrumental in Bersih, to those who don't know. A fun fact about Dr. Wong Chin Huat is he is always going to be wearing black until the day Malaysia sees a truly fair and free elections. Over to you, Chin Huat.
Thank you, Liana, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I think, as Ben said, this is a conversation long overdue that we need to talk about it. And so what I'm going to do is to answer that questions. I put my case forward, can Firstpastthepost encourage politics of moderation in Malaysia? And my answer is really, it depends on your luck. That's why I show you a dice here. Now, we talk about incentive. Politicians are just like normal human beings. They are driven by gain and pain, by carrot and stick. Electoral system, to think of it one way, is a machine that translates votes into seats. So it's a machine. What they really decide there is the number of seats in the constituency and what formula do you use. But you always remember that some votes are not counted. So now this is always the votes for the loser. That's the wasted vote. And our system is called Firstpastthepost. Now, why is it called Firstpastthepost? This actually came from a British idea, a British sport called horse race. This is the post. So the first horse that passed the post is the winner. Everyone else is a loser. What does it mean? It means that you have only one winner, and the loser can't come and say, how come we are not represented? No, that's a whole logic of the game. You need to win or you stand to be punished. So this is about Firstpastthepost that we talk about wasted vote. The votes that goes to the loser that are not translated into any seats. If you have a straight fight, then the percentage of wasted vote can be as high as 50%. If you have a three-corner fight, it can be as high as 2/3. And a four-corner, 75%. I'll give you a real example here. This is a six-corner fight on the surface, but really, the top three candidates won 98% of the votes. So it's a three-corner, and you can see it's very, very even. The winner, Dr. Jeffrey Kettingan, younger brother of Pyrin Kettingan, he won 33%. What does it mean? It means 67% of the voters are not represented. They were actually not there. They do not have any representation in the parliament. Why do we actually have this idea? The British idea is that, well, if you do not like losing, you should get united. If you cannot get united, you deserve to lose. It's a big stick. So the logic here is to cause pain so that you learn how to get united. Now, and if you have a British population, this is a picture at Brexit. But the UK I talk about is in the good old years before Brexit. In the good old years before Brexit, you assume the society is actually do not have deep divide. So the party, as what Ben told you, would actually converge into two blocks. Why? Because politicians do not want to run and lose. So they go to join one of the big party. And so that you have a chance to be parliamentarian, and next you have a chance to be minister, to form government. And because you have two groups, two parties that come to the middle and compete, you have moderation. because they compete in the center. So the idea here, a first past the post, the very cruel fact that you need to get punished if you lose is to force you to unite for competition. I'm going to show you what happened in Malaysia. We have 3 patterns. This is the first pattern. If it's not very clear, I explain to you. This is a sandwich. Because you do not see 2 parties coming together. This is the case for Malaysia most of the time before 1990, with the exception of 1974, and then in 1995, and then in 2004. You have a multi-ethnic government sandwiched by a Malay-based opposition and a non-Malay-based opposition. So the government in the middle would try to strike deal, and then the Malay-based opposition, for most of the time it was passed, that would say, well, the government is selling out the Malays. And then non-Malay-based opposition, for most of the time after 1969, as DAP, would say, no, the government is marginalizing the non-Malays. And the government say, this is actually Dr. Mahathir's favorite word, because we are making everyone not happy. You know that we are fair. This is the first pattern. This is nothing close to what we have with the British system. And with a government in the middle, you have to live with the fact that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts, absolutely. So along the way, people come to think and say, well, we should be able to achieve what the British do. So we want to have a 2 collation system. We can't have 2 parties because we are party animals. Malaysians like to have many parties, so at least we lump them together into collation. Then we at least would have something as close as the British system. So you have a multi-ethnic government, you have a multi-ethnic opposition. That's the case that in 1990 to 1995, 1999 to 2001, 2008 to 2015. And what's the problem? The problem is unsustainable. I'm going to move a bit forward to show you what I mean. This is the case. This is from 1990 to 2008. You see all this is the ruling coalitions. Up to 2008, it was Barisan Nasional. And this is the opposition. The one in the middle is a multi-ethnic opposition. You can see they have been changing name. We have 4 attempts. They never last. And finally, you have Pakatan Harapan winning over and become the multi-ethnic government. What happened to Barisan Nasional? Barisan Nasional become a Malay-based opposition. So we do not have, we wanted a 2 coalition politics, but we never have it on a sustainable ground. Now you probably understand why I happen to be in this sustainable center, development center. Okay, next. As what we have today, after 2008, is a toxic 2 coalition system because you have a multi-ethnic government and a mono-ethnic opposition and the others in Sabah and Sarawak. This is the situation we are in. So I have 5 questions to ask. The first question is really about what Ben talked about. This is actually a larger debate than in Malaysia, and I'm so grateful that we have Ben here. He is actually the person who coined the term. He did not invent the entire theory, but he coined the term centripetalism. So the question here is this: if we have a 2 bloc and they're competing with the center, we know this is centripetal. This was what we have for most of the time. While the government would do vote pooling, but the opposition are actually pulling them apart. Is this still centripetal? It's a question of whether this is half full or half empty. There's no clear-cut answer. But what I'm questioning here is this is what we are facing. You have a multi-ethnic government, but you're going to have opposition coming from one end, pulling it off from the center. It is still centripetal depending on how you define it, but the question is may not be an inclusive outcome as we want. Is it still centripetal? This is the first question that we really need to think. Going beyond the real politics is a larger question. Next, why did 2 coalition competition emerge, but then they did not last? It's basically asking the question, how did PAS and DAP fall in love in 1990, in 1999, in 2008 up to 2013? The real reason is because UMNO was split. Your enemy is split, it's time for you to, finding new lovers, really is because prospect of winning power. And why did they fail? The official reason, the reason on the surface is over-Islamization. Every 3 times they fall out of love is because Sharia law. But the real reason is because there's no prospect of winning power. If you have prospect of winning power, you would not fight over little thing. There's a fundamental problem with our system. It's partly the system, it's partly the society. I call it a mismatch between the society and the system. Is that it doesn't pay for you to be electorally to be in the center. You know why? Because our society is actually multipolar. Our society is multipolar in that sense that you actually have 2 big blocks, the Malay, Muslim, Bumiputra, non-Malay, non-Muslim, non-Bumiputra. It's very, very true in West Coast Malaya. It's not actually so true for the rest of the country. What's the problem with this is that we are very jealous of each other, we're very kiasu. And so therefore, for any party to go to the center, it is actually suicidal. You know what is moderation? Moderation is like Diet Coke. It's low-fat milk. It's decaf coffee. It's non-alcoholic beer. What it means that all these are healthier options, but really it's not interesting. People want to have some excitement. That's why parties are stronger at the fringe. So, and what really happened after 2018? Why did the East Malaysian Party leave BN and push UMNO towards PAS? Because they don't see any chance of coming back to power for now. So what I'm showing you here is a different pictures of the stick. What get PAS and DAP and all these parties moderate is not because of their ideology, but because of the carrot. The carrot that is called executive power. The prospect of coming to become government, to become minister, to have resources to please your voters, that get people moderate. When they do not have that luxury, they have to be hero. They have to take hard stand. I have shown you this. Question 3. Shouldn't Malaysia fear too much division? I think what we really should fear is the wrong division. Why? Because democracy is all about division. If you do not want division, you do not want parties, how can you have democracy? Right? If you want unity, if this is what you want, you should go North Korea. Then you have perfect unity. There's no competition at all. There's no differentiation. Our choice here, I need you to raise your hand if later. A, division along communal line. That means that we are divided by our ethnic groups, by our religious faith. Or B, division across communal line. We are split over class, whether you're pro-capital, you're pro-market, or you're pro-state, you're pro-environment, or pro-development, whatsoever thing, find some reason to divide ourselves. But let it cut across ethnic line. C, unity. Okay, how many people go for A? How many people go for B? How many people go for C, unity? Damn, no one believes in unity. Okay, finally someone. The question is, can Firstpastthepost deliver? Now, you know that gentleman up there? That was a former MP of Sungai Siput. He was a very good MP by most people's recognition. But this guy could not even retain 1/8 of the votes. In the last election, he lost his deposit when he contested against Pakatan Rakyat and Barisan Nasional. Because the system wouldn't give him any chance. This is a multi-ethnic group in Penang protesting against environmental destruction. There's a demand, a need for a Green Party, but there would not be a chance of any Green Party. Because you wouldn't be able to win enough votes to win anywhere under our system. So question 4, what will most likely happen in GE15 if we keep Firstpastthepost? People like to think and say, if we move away from Firstpastthepost, we will be in danger because we are going into uncharted water. We're going to areas we've never been but let me show you what happened if we keep to the same game. If the things go the way they do now, UMNO and PAS will win 30 parliamentary seats. They lost in GE14 because of three corners. The reason why you have a change of government, for all other reasons, that's a very important point. Najib miscalculated. He thought that PAS going in would split enough votes to split enough votes from Pakatan to save BN. It did to some extent. BN won 39 seats because of three-corner fight, but Pakatan also won 30 seats. UMNO and PAS has tasted the stake in Firstpastthepost. They learned the lesson, they come together. If they come together, you would have 30 seats gone. Now that does not guarantee they would become government, but that guarantee PH would be out of power. The next government would be a post-election collation. You really don't have a choice even you want to go back and say, we want a very neat outcome. We want a simple, single party government. No way, it's over. For UMNO and PAS to reconcile, however, you need the Malays, Muslim to feel threatened. Enemies and the enemies of enemies can be your friend only when you feel that your enemy is powerful. So for that reason, the non-Malay Muslim need to play boogeyman. Otherwise, why should Malay Muslim get united? We are talking about a population of what? 18 million. Why should 18 million people to have the same political taste? You need an enemy. And therefore, ethno-religious tension will rise before and during G15, not necessarily after, regardless how the government promotes goodwill. Why? Because if you believe that Malay Muslims are threatened, you find every evidence to prove yourself. You can wake up people who are really sleeping, but you can never wake up someone who pretends to be sleeping. Last question. Why is Firstpastthepost a wrong remedy for Malaysia? Forget about all this text. My newer version actually have more graphic. In simple story, high wasted votes is a price for you to be failure. So we like to think that we all like democracy, that we like to have opposition to check on government. But in a highly ethnicized environment like ours, what we have in mind is that we want the other community to provide the opposition. We say united in the government. Now, to get less abstract, before 2008, the Chinese, I happen to be one, so I know the story, would lament that, we Chinese are so divided. You see, the Malays are so united, therefore we are losing out. After 2008, this is what the Malays say. You see, the Chinese are so united. We Malays are so divided. We are losing out. Now, really the question here, if communities are punished for having choices, how do we expect to have democracy? I think we talk too much about democracy, about rights. We never really think about, realistically, about democracy is competition. How do we sustain the competition? This is a question that I want to put forward. I'm not offering you a solution in this 20 minutes, but I want to challenge some of the myths that we have of our system. Now, I'm going to show you this exactly what I mean by wasted vote. Sorry, the picture here is not very clear, but the last bar show you 2018 result, and the earliest bar is 1999. All these percentage are votes that are not counted. In these last elections, 43% of votes in West Malaysia are not counted. What it means? 43% of the voters have voted wrongly for the loser. They do not have representative in the government. If you break down by the party, you can see the party have different share. For DAP and PKR, they did very well. Way less than 5% for DAP, and this is about roughly 5%, because most of the votes that go for DAP and PKR are translated into seats. Now, you look at this is Bersatu, this is PAS, this is UMNO, 60% of their votes are not there. Because they are competing each other. It's a very simple theory, it's no rocket science. If you are in high competitions, you're going to split your votes and the loser are not getting representation. Now, is this any wonder that Malays are feeling politically anxious? It's not about the cultural context, it's not about social history, it is very much the political context. So, conclusion. Division to democracy is like heir to fire or aging to longevity. You may not like it, but it's part of the fact you can't draw away from that. And Firstpastthepost set out to force unity for competition. In Malaysia, it, however, have unintended consequences. It suppressed intra-ethnic, cross-ethnic division. It killed off the space for non-communal parties. And it induced the opposition to be radicalized or irresponsible when they do not see the prospect of power. And just a little bit extra, even for the collation in government, the system provides no rooms for friendly competition of coalition partners. So over time, they become uncompetitive and they resort to patronage, gerrymandering, malapportionments to solve their problem. So what's the solution? The solution is that this is the most important thing, is to reduce Malay-Muslim anxiety over the high cost of political division. Because if they don't, you would end up having an UMNO and PAS coalition. Second, enable cross-communal, intra-communal divide and non-communal parties. Now, I'm showing you that picture. That's a house spider. It is harmless, but most of us fear spider no matter what, right? We need to overcome the fear of hung parliament. Meaning that a parliament that without a single party holding a majority. Because if you want to have post-election coalitions, you want to spread out the incentive for party to be moderate, you need to have that. And finally, we need to build a solid social base that is supporting reforms and inclusion, instead of hoping a brutal electoral system can force parties into moderation. Now, why I'm against this? Because Firstpastthepost is fundamentally a gamble. You may achieve what you want, but it depends on the dice. So how sure that the luck is on your side? Beware of what you wish for. Thank you.
Ben, Jacinda Ardern is a personal hero of mine. And there is a part of me that the realistic / pessimistic part of me say that it is going to be extremely tough to have a female prime minister in Malaysia with very liberal views in her politics. Could a centripetal system, and is New Zealand using a centripetal system, allow for this to happen?
That's a good question. Thank you. I'm not sure if this is working, but I'll. So, yes, Jacinda Ardern is very popular these days, and her reaction to the shooting in Christchurch was, very impressive and widely admired. It was interesting to me. She was actually giving an interview about a week after that, and talking about the need for greater inclusion, or really how New Zealand had moved. Yeah. And she just said it as an aside, but she said the key thing was when we changed our electoral system, which they did. So they moved away from Firstpastthepost back in, this is about 20 years ago now. Yeah. So they moved from Firstpastthepost towards a mixed member proportional system. And the objective there was very much about a more inclusive political system where minorities and majorities like women were better represented in the political process. And since they made that change, it has really had very dramatic impacts. They moved away from a two-party system towards a much more multi-party system. They've had coalition governments, and they have a much higher level of diversity in their parliament. So, you know, I think it's a good example that you raised. Whether that's a centripetal system, I'm not so sure. It's more about a system in which the full diversity of New Zealand society is represented through the electoral system. But New Zealand wasn't a society with very deep divisions. They had a division between the indigenous people, the Maori and others, but you know, it was a different kind of society than, say, Malaysia. But it's a useful example to look at, yes.
Is there a case study that you think Malaysia could use?
Oh, there's actually, we were talking at the Electoral Commission yesterday. I think there's quite a lot of interest in looking at New Zealand, and there's been a lot of academic works tracing the impact of the electoral system reform. So there's lots of potential lessons there, I think, for reformers. But it would mean, to put this in very practical terms, were Malaysia to move in this direction, it would require constitutional change. It would require changes to all the constituency boundaries, because only half of the seats would be elected from constituencies. The other half of the seats would be elected at a national level. You'd have to have some seats that maybe politicians could move from one to the other. It's quite a big change to the electoral system, but yeah, could be done.
Thanks. Chin Huat, contrary to popular belief, I am a Malay. But also contrary to what you just said, I am more anxious that PAS and UMNO is becoming very friendly to each other. Do you think that current efforts, especially by the Electoral Reform Committee, to change our electoral system would really, reduce this anxiety that you just mentioned just now?
I have the honor to serve on the ERC, but here I'm not speaking on the ERC. What I can say is that ERC is conducting a lot of public engagement exercise state by state. So in the process, we do raise all these things. We do not have a fixed answer, even though personally I have my own preference. Now I'm speaking as a political scientist. I think the whole question here is whether we are going to face the elephant in the room and take the bull by its horn. A lot of non-Malays and liberals want to see PAS and UMNO sideline by getting them to lose in a centripetal game because they may not get the size. Now, in the past, that has been the case. But even you go back to 80s, when PAS was very much a regional party, PAS have not failed to ideologically control UMNO, pushing UMNO slowly matching its game. So that centripetal force have not been so effective in the past. If you really want to deal with this, I think a lot of the solution have to go back to society. But what is immediately important is to allow UMNO and PAS to compete against each other. Not everyone in UMNO wants to work with PAS. Clearly, those UMNO in Sabah left using this as a reason. There are many more in the parties who, if they have a choice, want to stay out of PAS and compete against Pakatan independently. But given the system here, they both, UMNO and PAS, will be punished. So they would be pushed together, and that could only work if UMNO and PAS can compete on their own strength and not being punished for standing against each other. And that will require a PR system. It's not even a preferential system like supplementary vote or alternative vote. But how do you convince people? For me, the constitutional hurdle is the least, because what is more important is how do you get a cross-party consensus. But to get a cross-party consensus, you need to also convince the larger public, especially in a highly ethnicized context here. So why should Malay opt for a PR system, whether it's an Indonesian full list PR or a German and New Zealand type of mixed member proportional. My reason is really this. If Malays want to have multi-party competition, they should not be punished excessively, which is inevitable under Firstpastthepost. If Malays want to avoid this cause, they would have to stay united under one party. And the price is very clear-cut. If you're locked in to a party or even to a level, you easily get exploited. There's a Malay saying, harapkan pega, pega makan padi. You keep a kind of wild bird to eat the pest, to protect your crop. But the bird would like to eat your crop as well. So what's the option? You cannot take that away. In management, that is called the principal agent problem. You can't do away, it's part of human nature. You can only do away by having a lot of pega to choose from, right? And now this is what we need to put forward and say why this is good. To have a PR system, NEP will not be gone in one generation time. Any changes would be much more gradual, but would come with a greater basis of social consensus. Those are real work that we need to do. I think to assure that Malays would not lose out in policy term would be the key thing that why they want a more democratic system. A more inclusive, a least costly political system. Sorry.
Okay, so I came to the academic institution believing that because we can make changes through the academia world. So what would be your advice on what are the little steps that we can make so as to progress on this electoral reforms?
Well, as I said at the end of my presentation, reforming electoral systems is very difficult because there is always the problem that whoever's in power is nervous about changing the system under which they were elected. So that's the starting point. Difficult. If you look at electoral reform that's happened in other countries, normally there's some combination of a political crisis, a very deep long-term elite consensus that there is something wrong with the system, the existing system, but also public pressure. Now, most people find this topic very boring, right? Most people really find the discussion of electoral systems as a very dull subject, and it's very hard to get the mass public interested in it. But equally, if they can see that there is something fundamentally flawed, something maybe fundamentally unfair, or maybe they can see that an existing set of rules encourages ethnic conflict rather than dilutes it, then you can start to make progress. There is this window of opportunity now in Malaysia because you've had, I think, such a long period of erosion of the electoral system, the rules of the game. And there's lots of areas that we didn't talk about today that, second-tier reforms, an independent electoral commission, truly independent, a process of electoral boundary drawing that is also done in such a way that's more independent from political consideration, so you don't have gerrymandering. There's lots of things that can be done now, and I think some things that will be done to really improve the way the electoral process works. But these bigger electoral system issues, it's a combination of, as I say, politicians are always going to be self-interested, so they're never going to make a decision they think will actively hurt them, but maybe some modest reforms that the political class think will not hurt them and will benefit the country, especially if there's a public support. That's probably the best way forward. That's not terribly optimistic, right? No, normally these things don't happen.
Do you want to add?
Yeah. To get politicians to agree to reform is to convince them that luck is not on their side. reforms are never done by people who believe they win. If you believe your luck is good, there's no way I can persuade you to stop gambling and buy insurance. To go for a system like proportional representation is basically opting gambling, the joy of gambling, for the security in buying insurance. And it's hard for politicians to see that, but often they can conceal their ignorance, their disregard very easily because they blame it on the public. They say, you're talking about something Malaysians' publics are not ready, prepared for, come back in 20 years' time. But if they start facing people, their constituents, never mind even in a middle-class neighborhood like Sunway, they come across someone from their nephew or nieces who come and question them, then politicians cannot have the face, put on a poker face and say, I never heard of electoral system. I never heard of MMP. I never heard of supplementary vote and so on. They have to come at least with an answer. I know about this and I think Firstpastthepost is good. Put up a proper defense. What is worse for us now is not even making the wrong choice. It is the absence of debate. And so I applaud you that, for spending 1.5 hours to listen to us talking on this supposedly dry topic. That's a good start. Because if we have more Malaysians talking about this, wars are coming down.
Thank you. My name is Rash Bihari from the Edge newspaper. I think Malaysians are in a very unfamiliar situation because having had one stable government which has been providing development for 6 decades, and also with a very well-defined identity-based basis for public discourse. So the first thing that people need to confront is, are we allowed to think beyond our identities in other forms? So I think it's an unfamiliar, area for Malaysians. So maybe in such a situation, if we can look at other countries that have been through this before us, how did it turn out for them when they opted for change or when they in the process of transforming the political system? What was their experience? Like this, if the panelists can address that issue.
Well, that's a big question, and Malaysia is unique in some ways. I mean, every country is unique. It's not obvious to me that there is a country you can point to in the world and say, here's the equivalent to Malaysia, and this is what they did. But of course, the broader process of modernisation does entail at some level a move away from ascriptive identity, tribal, whatever, sectarian affiliations towards more broader civic affiliations. This was what Chin Huat was talking about in terms of cross-cutting cleavages, where maybe you don't lose your identity, but other issues, class, post-material issues like the environment might start to take over. So that's a very long-term process, but at some level, pretty much every country, long-term democracy has gone through elements of that, where they had, even in my country, we had quite sectarian politics 100 years ago, and now those things have kind of disappeared, no one cares. Other countries have dealt with this ethnic issue quite differently to Malaysia. Some countries have just abandoned the idea of democracy altogether. Some countries, I mentioned the Indonesians, have constructed their politics in a way that those sorts of, at least not religion, but ethnic, regional cleavages don't get replicated in the political system. So they still exist in society, but they're just not there in politics. Some countries have tried to go the other direction, and they completely guarantee every last seat on an ethnic basis, Lebanon and others. We will guarantee that there will be this many Shia and this many Maronites and this many whatever Christians in the parliament, and so it's the competition is taken off the table. You can't win more seats for your group because it's fixed. So there are other ways of doing it. I wouldn't recommend them particularly, but there are many countries have tried to deal with this issue of identity politics, because I mean, the bottom line is that it is so easy to mobilise voters on an identity basis, and as soon as you start doing it, it's hard to compete. It's just what you were saying about trying to get other issues, environmental issues on the agenda. Sure, they're on the agenda in many countries, but in an ethnically based political system, that's always going to win. So I'm sorry, again, that's not a very good answer. Maybe Chin Huat's got a better one.
I think the question is how to give out our obsession for unity, because it's very clear-cut. Most people do not like communal division. And naturally, we fall back thinking the solution is unity. But unity is fundamentally incompatible with democracy. And so if you get in that way, you would keep on arguing and say, how should we get united? And we never go out of it. Because in the talk of unity itself, there is power relations. So if we want to move away from that, we have to consciously thinking about how to divide ourselves. The solution would be to have more elections, and I specifically would say we should have local elections, the third would, and maybe the fourth would. So you elect your own community leadership, your housing garden community, rather than put your effort into residents association, which are just social organization. Why is it important to get into local elections? Because if you have local elections, you can have more party to come out. One jargon that neither Ben or I brought in is the question of threshold. What's the percentage of votes you need to win to get a seat? If you don't get a seat, there's no measurements of your success. No one would play a game that you never win, right? So you want to change politics, you have to lower the threshold for people to easily get a seat in a decision-making body. If it's local government, then it has even taxing power with a very niche constituency. At a local level, it's easy enough for you to find enough votes to get on board on environmental issue, on women issue, on class issue, and so on. But it gets harder if you go up. So you need to find a way how to create this and split people. We need to overcome the fear of too many elections, too much politics. No, politics is just basically our human behavior. We are pursuing power because there's market failure and you have public goods and state is a solution. It's all these things, it is common sense, but we were never taught. Up until 10 years ago, we all fear politics. It's time for us to grow up. Seriously, I talk about politics. Democracy is about growing up. You see why? We say democracy is about people making decisions, right? Now, making decision is an act of adulthood. So adult people can make decisions. Adult human can make decisions. Underage human cannot make decisions. Adult dog, adult cats can never make decisions. To empower ourselves to say we can make decisions and therefore deserve the government we elect is to recognize that we are adult enough to be human.
My name is Liang. I'm from the private sector. I'm an old man, old 72 years old. But during my days, unity is there. I mean, during my time, we can sit in a coffee shop and drink with my Malay friends. We talk. No issue. So this country, what we need is unity and re-education. Don't you think we need a massive re-education of the people, that they will not divide each other, which is what all the elections now is having difficulty. You go by ethnic lines, racial lines. You see, during my time in my school days, we play together, Malay, Chinese, no matter. We eat in the canteen, no problem. My father's coffee shop, we have Malays playing mahjong even. You see, there's no issue. I think, don't you think what we need is a massive re-education of the population, starting from young. that we are all the same. We go together as one nation, as a Malaysian nation. Stop talking about racial lines. That's where then you can talk about electoral reforms. Then they'll understand why we need proportional representation and so on. Yeah, thank you.
A lot of when we discuss this topic about political reform, the first question they always ask is, how fast can it happen? So I know Dr. Wong is in the committee, so can you update us on that? And I just want to take a very important one is what's the status of the local council election now?
My name is Yo. My question to the panel is this. Are there enough data from the PR system that indicates that it is an effective system too to block vote buying and other forms of corrupt practices vis-a-vis elections? So maybe you can use that to make politicians take a stand against corruption.
Okay, my question is, Wong mentioned that if PAS and UMNO has joined hand at the last elections, they might win the elections instead of Pakatan Harapan. So if the coming the 15th general elections, the same situations happen, it seems like a good reasons to persuade the current government to change the current electoral system. But why they are seems like not doing so? Can you explain why, or is that the reason why they formed the Electoral Reform Committee now? Thanks.
I answer your question very straightforward. That the government, and your question too, the government has not made a decision on this. The electoral reform committees are going on. We are preparing an interim report later in this year. The whole committee is going to finish it in 2 years' time. And whether or not electoral system change can happen really depends on two questions: whether the parties they see themselves at risk, and how would the public look at this. If the public is not aware of what happened, then it's very easy to use as an excuse. But the real determinant is whether you believe that luck is not necessary on your side. At the end of the day, we are talking about politicians thinking they're the lucky gambler. As much as gambling is not supposed to be halal in this country, but most people are indulged in that. And how fast local electoral system change, we do not know. I mean, local elections, that the minister YB Juraida is committed to that, and her own schedule is she would study all these things, and implementation would come in 2021 under the new prime minister. So that's her plan.
You mean Tun M won't live forever?
Huh? No, Tun M has rejected that. Yeah, he has rejected that. So your questions about whether you can stop corruptions, right? If you think about vote buying, it actually pays for you to buy votes in Firstpastthepost, assuming that you have a constituencies of 10,000, 80% turnout, you're talking about 8,000 voters, right? Let's say if a straight fight, each side would have 4,000, and if it's very, very slow match, you probably need to buy 500 votes, and you tip off the balance. Now, how much would you pay for that 500 votes? What happens if you have a list PR system? You would have multiple members. You are now talking about, let's say, instead of 1 seat, you have 10 seats in a constituency. To get an extra seats, you probably need to move up 3 or 4% points at least, or may go up to 6-7% point for another seats. And that's probably easily talk about, let's say, talking about the same size, 100,000, you talk about a few thousand votes. So the cost itself would deter you from going for the margin, because it's not the margin, it's a totality. So in that sense, PR is less inducive for election rigging. I think I cover, just your questions, right? People of Mr. Liang, people of your generation are lucky enough to have that memory that people are united. But if I may do so, I would frame that in the context. Our early years are also at the time when politics are not fully appreciated, are not fully exercised. And if people are really not political, it's actually very easy to talk about unity. And the problem, don't blame it on politicians. It's really that what it means by not being political is that you're not conscious on your self-interest. You haven't learned about how to organize yourself politically. Of course, it's much easier to talk about that. And the challenge is always, do we want democracy?
I'd rather have that than to have what we are talking right now.
North Korea. North Korea, sir. North Korea, sir.
Oh dear. Ben,
Thank you.
any last comments about these questions or anything that you wanna?
No, I think Chin Huat's covered it pretty well. It's not just Malaysia. The whole world is more politicized. Look what's happened in the United States or in the UK. There is an awareness. Social media and the internet has also played a big part. It's all heightened these days, and polarization is occurring in countries that have never really experienced it before. So this isn't just a Malaysian problem, but I think it's unusually acute when you mix this with identity politics. And I think it does just heighten the fact that if you can make some reforms that maybe just lessen the incentives to go down that route, and there is an opportunity to make reform now, it's certainly worth investigating. I'd just leave it at that.
Okay. Okay, so on that note, I think takeaway messages from today is, yes, we are moving towards reform. We can move towards reform. Probably not in one generation. Yeah, it depends on how hard we work. And hopefully in 20 years' time, maybe we'll see a female prime minister in Malaysia. I don't know. Like New Zealand. So with that, Selamat Hari Raya, everyone. Maaf Zahir Batin. Do enjoy the holidays next week. Bye.